I always do this these days. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're talking about Spider-Man Beyond and all the news Marvel's been releasing around the character Spider-Man. That might sound like a vague title, but there's more than enough here that I think this will be a bit of a discussion about where the character's at these days and what's been going on. But at first I'm going to take a sip of handy water here because I'm thirsty. And we're probably going to be talking for a little bit. So, lately the Spider-Man comics have been written by a fellow named Nick Spencer, but he is on the way out, if not out already. I think he's gone at this point. Nick Spencer took over from Dan Slott, who essentially has been writing Spider-Man for the modern age. Dan Slott, as a writer for Spider-Man in said modern age, I knew that was coming, had a lot of problems as a writer, and I've done whole videos on that. But Nick Spencer has kind of addressed some of those problems, but Spider-Man still suffers from some of the issues I identified years ago, so it wasn't a complete solution, but Nick Spencer certainly seems... Yeah, okay, I'll let that through. I don't know what YouTube's about these days, but that's fine. And so I'm not dead set against, like... Oh, sorry, I was reacting to his chat, but I'm not dead set against Nick Spencer's writing of Spider-Man, but in general, I still think there was room for improvement. I like stuff where Spider-Man was living with roommates, and they were pretty adorable. Nick Spencer kind of brought back Boomerang as depicted in his Superior Foes of Spider-Man books, so that was fun. And usually the more light-hearted Spider-Man stories, or even just the stuff where like Mary Jane was kind of coming back into the story, all felt pretty good, but Spider-Man still felt like it was almost stalled out, and it was unclear where the story was going, and it isn't really clear if that story really went anywhere ultimately, other than just where modern Spider-Man's kind of always been, which is just sort of running in place. So with all that in mind, Zeb Wells is kind of taking over post Nick Spencer. Now that's another writer who I've reviewed really good books by him in Marvel recently, and some that are a lot more middling and less exciting. He is certainly a capable writer though, and that isn't necessarily enough to judge on its own. And with him is a lot of other talent, which I do really like, including Saladin Ahmed, chief among them, because I'm a big fan of his works. And he has written for Spider-Man before with Miles Morales. We got Kelly Thompson, who's a good writer, and Patrick Gleason doing a lot of the artwork that you're seeing kind of flashed by in a sort of cropped look on screen here. And just because of the way they formatted these preview images. And that artwork has me excited. But the big news of today, which I put right in the chat and thumbnail because Marvel's been broadcasting this left and right, is apparently Peter Parker's going to die and Ben Reilly is going to take over, which is fascinating on a few counts. And people are already kind of bringing him up in chat and their opinions of it, which I will get to. I'm not entirely ignoring chat on purpose right now. I just want to explain, I guess, to everyone who Ben Reilly is, because I think that's an important first step. Ben Reilly is Peter Parker's clone, and over the course of a story from the 90s called the Clone Saga, I'm really kind of oversimplifying things here, but that's the point of we're just doing a simple summary. Peter Parker, essentially, the character retired, we'll say, and stopped being Spider-Man, and for a while Ben Reilly took over. That went on for a little while, but due to various problems behind how the stories were being told, and the Clone Saga kind of got dragged out, which was the story that dealt with this changeover, Ben Reilly's time as Spider-Man was relatively short-lived, but pretty memorable. And over the years, as he and another clone named Kane have kind of found their own identity and series, often as the Scarlet Spider, they've become fan favorites, including like Victor C saying, "I'm all for Ben Reilly, one of my favorites." But then we also have Matt saying like he doesn't care about Ben and he'd rather have Kane Parker back, who is another Scarlet Spider, we'll say. But another clone who has his own history. And we've done origins and bio videos for both Ben Reilly and Kane. They're perfectly serviceable characters in their own right, so I don't have anything wrong with that. Nobody important says, except on Tuesday, says maximum clonage. Yeah, so there's a long history with clones and Ben Reilly and Kane. That doesn't even really get into like the clone conspiracy stuff where Ben Reilly turned villain for a little bit, which will probably come up over the course of this run. But the new news is a little different than what we've heard before, because in the past, I think Peter ran off with Mary Jane, if I'm remembering it correctly, and Ben Reilly kind of took over. But here, Peter's apparently being killed off, at least for a time, obviously, and Ben Reilly's taking over. And it is interesting. Some of the articles I was reading was talking about the guy who made the Blue Lightning Superman and how he was saying, you need to have Blue Lightning Superman once in a while just so people can appreciate and understand how awesome regular Superman is. Which is, I think, a good way of looking at this. It's not the end of the world or anything like that, but we're shifting gears ever so slightly towards Ben Reilly for a little while, and then eventually Peter Parker will come back and it'll be a whole thing. It's certainly nothing new in the world of modern Spider-Man, where we have historical things like Superior Spider-Man, where other characters were taking over instead of Peter Parker for a while, for all intents and purposes. But it is a pretty big move, and the articles that I was reading about it were also talking about like how weird it is because of the Spider-Man movie coming out, and also at the same time, apparently there's this mini-series coming out near the end of this year, which features the death of Doctor Strange. So in a year where there should be a Doctor Strange movie coming out and a Spider-Man movie coming out, or like pretty soon, both these characters are apparently being killed off in the comics, which seems strange to me. I really do think, though, it kind of, people have the timing maybe wrong in their heads because of the pandemic. We've sort of had to shift things a little bit. So instead, we now have a situation where these movies are coming out later than they would have normally. So maybe the plan was for Marvel Comics, after the movies came out and all that hubbub had died down, they were going to explore other things for like Doctor Strange and Spider-Man by killing off Stephen Strange and Peter Parker. I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of my interpretation of things. The other thing I've been thinking about, because it's kind of weird to kill off two big characters like that at the same time, is perhaps it's a bit of a fake out for whatever's going on with Doctor Strange, while these plans with Spider-Man seem a little more concrete. We're going to apparently be exploring Ben Reilly's character for a little while. Now, as for how I feel about that, that's an interesting question. Because I only found out about this stuff today, although a lot of the news has been brewing for a while, and I've kind of gotten bits and pieces before that. Today I kind of sat down and did a bunch of research for this, reading the solicitations, looking through some preview images, hearing what Marvel and the writers and artists have to say on the matter, and ultimately deciding, I don't really know what to make of it beyond just we'll have to see when we get there, I guess, because it's exciting news and it's interesting. I'm glad for Ben Reilly fans for him to have his moment in the sun. There is the other side of it feeling a little predictable, and we kind of know what's going to happen, because even if Peter Parker's character is killed off, it doesn't reek of permanence, almost feeling like an impulse on behalf of Marvel, but certainly not anything that's going to last long term, especially because, like the article points out, Peter Parker's just about to star in a movie, and it's unclear where the character's going from here. It doesn't really seem to me like Marvel is playing games like they were before with movie rights, though. It just seems like we're just trying something different, because I also don't know what really the plan is for Spider-Man or where this character's going. It doesn't kind of feel like there's a concrete direction where there is for some other characters, like with the X-Men right now, for example. So that I'm not entirely sure of myself. So mixed feelings, I guess, is an overall summation of how I'm currently feeling about it. I do love Patrick Gleason as an artist, and that's part of where I get more excited, because he's interesting. We have people like Saladin Ahmed, who's an interesting writer, and that makes me curious, but I'm not fully confident either. Now, Keenan Tunk says, I wonder what happened with Ben, like what he's been up to, because after Clone Conspiracy, Ben got his own series, but he was all messed up with his face. But now, with this news being out about Ben Reilly, he's all better with blonde hair. That's an excellent point, and I'm glad, because I thought you were going to ask what happened after Clone Conspiracy, but yeah, I was going to say he had a whole little series after that, which he also refers to, where Ben almost is resembling like the Kane style transformation. I kind of was getting at when I talked about Clone Conspiracy a little earlier, I assume that stuff will have to be acknowledged or dealt with somehow. I also hated it. I hated Clone Conspiracy so damn much that I don't think there's anything wrong with kind of hand-waving all that content away and taking Ben in a new direction, because the old direction was terrible. Victor C says, I wish Ben had his original Spider-Man suit from the 90s, not this new one. But then Keenan says, I like this new suit better. The suit from the 90s was all crap. Well, personally, I kind of have a little bit of love for both. I think the old one with the jean jacket or whatever was a product of its time, but doesn't really look bad to me, and kind of is part of Ben's history, and an Admiral one, other than unlike the Anubis costume from Clone Conspiracy. And in comparison, this new suit, again, like, I like Patrick Gleason, and I actually do like that sketch we see coming by here and there. The image you guys are seeing is a little cropped, but there's some interesting tech to it that I quite enjoy, and I do like that costume. That person, like, I'm actually probably leaning more in Keenan's direction. That personally, I like it a little more than the 90s edition. Retro Kid Review says, I think this new suit is a bit of a throwback to it. Yeah, I guess so. It really reeks of like a modern suit to me, with again, like, there's that tech design, but even more angular spider icon on his back, which I can see on my image, but you can Google it for yourself. The off-center spider logo, I guess, is a bit of a throwback, and I do see that when you say it, but the suit does seem a little more mechanical and techy in nature than some of the older Spider-Man suits, which is why I'm hedging a little bit. Like, to me, it does seem a little bit more upgraded than certainly what Ben Reilly used before, but even just anything from pre-2000 Spider-Man. Kaden says, I don't know why people dislike Ben taking over as Spider-Man. I think the dislike is something that I've been trying to get at a little bit in this video here, where it's just so frustrating when the comics do something like this, because it feels like we're kind of running around with circles in Spider-Man. We know the arc of this story already, where it's like, well, Peter Parker's going to die, maybe it's going to be moving, quote unquote, but it's going to feel hollow because we've seen that story so much before. And then Ben Reilly's going to take over for a while, and then after a couple years at most, Peter Parker's going to come back, new writer will take over, maybe, and we'll have a new Amazing Spider-Man #1 to sell and review or whatever. And then, like, it almost feels as though we're going to rinse and repeat kind of thing. And that, I think, is where people get frustrated, because that doesn't feel like progress. If there was a way to kind of bring Ben Reilly back without following this pattern, either Ben having his own series, I don't think anyone would have been against that, where he kind of becomes a little more back on the normal path, or one where he, like, I don't know, exists at this, like, because I think people would be less hostile with this if it was like, oh, Peter and Mary Jane are going to get married again, and they're going to move out and, like, move off, and kind of settle and try and figure things out, and Ben Reilly's going to take over while Peter Parker's gone. That's a more honest way of going about this story, which probably would have had people excited. But because we're kind of following this direction, like, I didn't actually know there's fan outrage for Spider-Man Beyond, but I read the articles about it and thought that to myself, like, oh, people aren't going to like this because of that predictability. Shadowcatcher says, Peter Parker is one of Stan Lee's best tragic heroes, but Ben Reilly is even more tragic. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. I kind of glazed over Ben's story. And also, hey, Shadowcatcher, it's good to see you. I kind of glazed over Ben's story at the beginning of this video, but there is a lot of tragedy to it. Ben lived a very short life, given that he's a clone, kind of got to be Spider-Man for a very brief period, and then right as he was sort of stretching his wings and finding his identity as a superhero, he died pretty horribly. And then everything since then's been a mess, where Ben will often come back for a while, get to exist in some sort of spotlight again, only to die and have to be resurrected once more. And that's when we get to the point of him suddenly becoming a villain for Clone Conspiracy. A, it feels out of nowhere, and B, it just feels like we're piling on to the unfairness that is Ben Reilly's life as a character. And for fans of the character, I think he's honestly one of the worst treated fan bases. I said that wrong grammatically, but his fan base is treated wrong perhaps more than any other character historically, just because of the way they keep kind of like teasingly bringing him back only to kill him off again, then they bring him back and then they kill him off again. That is unfair to fans, I think, and hasn't historically been a good look from Marvel, I guess. I think people know what I'm getting at there, though. Okay, I need more water. That's part of it. So my throat's drying out. So, Ben Reilly says, legacy characters, here we go again with Ben Reilly. That's a good point too, and that kind of gets into what I was saying, where it feels very cyclical to be bringing these characters back again. And I think even Ben Reilly fans maybe should treat this with a bit of skepticism because of that pattern I've been talking about. And because Ben kind of seems on that trajectory again, where he could become Spider-Man, he gets to become the full-fledged Spider-Man again. And it's difficult to believe this story doesn't end with Ben dying, Ben being written out of the story in some weird convoluted way, or Ben just being cast aside unceremoniously in some form for Peter Parker's return. It's really hard to envision this story ending any other way. So I do think people are right to be frustrated by this. Keaton says, who knows what kind of adventures he's going to get. I don't know. Zeb Wells kind of reminds me of Nick Spencer as a writer, actually, where I think they can do the lighthearted stuff better than the more serious stuff, and the more the Spider-Man stories lean towards not necessarily being campy, goofy, or without stakes, but just being a little more lighthearted and fun, kind of the way most Spider-Man stories should be. That stuff's probably going to work a lot better than the darker stuff. Now, so one of you guys got a message under review from Facebook. I'm just going to read it for a second. Okay, that's fine. Because Kanan says, earlier someone was saying that they don't like Ben and they would prefer Kane. But why would Kane be better? Because Kane hates being called Spider-Man and hates it very much. And I think that's a fair question. I think I think it was Matt Volkin who, he said, Kane, or he wants, I think the way I interpret it is he more wants Kane to return, even if he's not going to call himself Spider-Man, or more stories focused on Kane, which I think is perfectly fine. That character could use exploration, or could use his own Scarlet Spider series, and that there's a lot of fun stuff that could be done with that. But I kind of agree, I definitely agree what Keenan's saying at the heart of it, where it's like, I don't think he'd call himself Spider-Man, but I think what Matt's getting at more is both of these characters feel often underserved by Marvel, so it would be nice to kind of have Kane back as opposed to bringing Ben back. But really, it's just two competing fan bases wanting these two characters back. Both can easily exist. There's room for them in stories and such. Though they often do feel rarer and less frequent. Like, you're much less likely to see Kane and Ben show up in any given story than Peter's to date. So I understand all of that. I guess my frustration is I don't feel Kane and Ben Reilly fans should be pitted against each other when really you're common issue is just how Marvel treats both characters relative to Peter. And I do think there's plenty of room, yeah, like I said, for these stories, even if they don't all, like, even if Ben, Peter, and Kane don't have series about them at all times published. They can show up in stories or whatever, or can have some sort of existence, even if it's not always being documented. And then you can have stuff where, like, maybe one of Peter's series occasionally diverts towards Ben Reilly and what he's up to in another city or something like that, which could work well. But you kind of got to do something. And I guess that's also where I got people and fans get frustrated, is it doesn't have to be adversarial. It feels almost counterproductive to have, okay, well, if we're going to have a story focus on Ben, we have to kill Peter Parker. That feels a little unnecessary and also not terribly organic, since Marvel's previewing all this stuff. It isn't really leaving it to come out of the story or anything like that. It feels like they want to build up to it and for it to be a thing. So it really reeks like a gimmick more than a move to shift the narrative to Ben Reilly because all of a sudden we're out of Peter Parker ideas or anything like that. I don't think there's any truth to either side of it. But it's just, it really is marketing, and that's okay, but that's where I think people are getting frustrated, since someone was wondering that in chat. I can definitely see why people are skeptical. Now, Matt's saying, Ben represents Marvel's lack of originality in the sense of repetitive storytelling. He's a reboot filler before they bring back Peter. Yeah, that's a good way of putting what I've been saying in this stream. If he kept his standalone, then he would be... I guess what he's saying is if you kept his story alone, then he would be great. Yeah, like if... that's kind of almost where the conclusion I arrived at, whereas like if this was just Ben Reilly starring in his own new series in Spider-Man Beyond, even if there isn't an active Peter Parker series going on, that would work for me. But that's the other side of it too, is apparently Spider-Man's expanding to being published 3 times within a month, which is nuts, and I will not be staying caught up with that because that's insane and it's going to take up way too much of my comics budget. And I am a little skeptical about some of these publication decisions I'm hearing because of all that. Victor C says, hopefully after Peter becomes Spidey, he's more involved with his brother's life because he's important to Peter and deserves the spotlight. I think he meant Ben at some point in that sentence, but I'm not entirely sure which one. 616 Man says, can Marvel and DC just go the multiverse route and have multiple Earths for different versions of characters to make everybody happy? Yeah, that's fine, but I don't even know why that's even necessary when you have stuff like Scarlet Spider or other variations, like even just Spider-Man Ben Reilly as a series name, and just telling different stories with different characters. Then you can also, maybe Ben Reilly doesn't sell enough or consistently to have his own side series in addition to the mainstream Spider-Man thing, so instead you just do Ben Reilly miniseries or something like that. And I think that's kind of the impression I'm getting from Chad, is something I was saying earlier, is like a lot of these decisions don't feel necessary as it means to bring Ben Reilly back. Plenty of people are excited about Ben Reilly, but we don't need to, I don't know, do yet another comic book death just for his sake. Matt was saying, sadly, he's just a placeholder, which is pretty much just wording what we were saying before, but I do agree. It's almost a good way of putting it, because that kind of feels like the case. Victor is saying, they better not kill him off again, since he has his own unique personality and developed his relationship with his brothers Kane and Peter. Okay, that kind of gives a little bit of context to what you were saying earlier. But I definitely feel like that's going to be the case, or he's going to just go off somewhere at the end of his story. And by go off, I mean like literally leave New York City and just sort of leave the story with it, and we won't see Ben for another few years after. Which is frustrating for Ben Reilly fans. And that's what I was getting at before, where it's like, I think Ben Reilly fans, maybe out of all the groups, should be most skeptical about this. Peter Parker fans should be very confident Peter's going to come back at some point. Kane fans can remain frustrated as always. And Ben Reilly just is doomed to go through the same thing he's been going through ever since he was introduced all over again. And yeah, that worked at a certain point for Ben Reilly's character as just this ring of tragedy around him, but now we're just getting ridiculous. And it's going to get to the point of self-parody. Keenan says, they say Ben Reilly is the best part of Peter Parker. That's interesting as an idea of him being cloned. I don't love that idea personally. I like him being a clone who just by function of his existence, who he is, and all the things that have happened to him, he's a different person. But them trying to lionize Peter Parker's personality or imply that like Ben was the best and Kane was the worst parts of Peter is a little rough around the edges for me, and I'd much prefer them to be their own people and clones as a result of their experience. Keenan's saying Peter Parker won't stay dead for good because they say that Ben's return is due to Peter Parker being dead. Yeah. Oh no, we've kind of covered that. But you're right, like we all know that. Matt was saying Ben is the light, Peter is the balance, and Kane is the dark. I prefer realistic, gritty storytelling, and Kane fits that better. He feels more human and relatable to me. Yeah, it's funny. I end up just saying everything Matt says, like 2 minutes after he writes it in chat, but it's just sort of the natural conclusion of what we're talking about here. I rather all three characters, which is more realistic, like they exist in a more gray line where it's like, yeah, Ben can kind of be the lighter side, but he can be capable of darkness, and I think that works. And maybe that is what you guys are getting at in chat, so I don't want to make a whole thing of it. Shadowcatcher saying, dark, yeah, the sign behind you, soul. Oh, yeah, that's a phrase from Time Runs Out because we were filming that review recently for grading the Avengers. Matt Volk, because it says everyone dies back there with a little surprise Pikachu. No one's pointed that out yet, so good for you, Shadowcatcher. That will make more sense when you see it in the filmed recorded video, but I just decided to leave it there. And my girlfriend drew that Pikachu and did a really awesome job. But Matt was saying, Kane's journey of self-discovery is much more compelling to me, but I still love Ben. I just wish he was treated better. Well, that's a good way of pointing it. Matt's been the resident skeptic towards Ben Reilly here, but I've read his comments as, and I hope other people have read it as, like, he's just being comparative. Because I didn't think you hated Ben or anything. But I think both characters, and it almost reeks of fan entitlement to say they deserve to be treated better, but I think people can tolerate a lot. Ben Reilly suffering a single tragic death is one thing, but the pattern of resurrection and fall for Ben Reilly is where people get frustrated, because then you are dangling with people's emotions and toying with it and stuff. And I do think it's worth, like, leaving that in a more diplomatic way with the fans. Because it almost doesn't feel like storytelling at that point, but just some weird joke at character's expense, which is frustrating. Victor said, you should discuss the differences between Ben and Peter's personality and the similarities as well. Well, and that's interesting because, like, at a fundamental level, they are clones, but I think Ben is more traumatized by the events of his life at this point. The like, him being created as a clone, apparently dying, coming back, being revealed to be the original, being revealed to actually have been the clone all along, dying again, coming back. I don't even know what happened. I think he died at one point again, but then coming back for Spider-Verse, only to die in that event. Like, that's where fans get frustrated, and I think that's reasonable. But that stuff also has led to an interesting character history, depending on how much you're willing to tolerate of a character who's been through hell and just hasn't been able to live a relatively normal life the way Peter Parker does, which has led to some resentment. A better writer could have handled that all well and show a character who, like, became desperate and erratic, turning into what he was in Clone Conspiracy. Unfortunately, the writer of that story was Dan Slott, and it was not written well whatsoever. But because of all that, their characters are different. But at his core, and especially when he was originally Spider-Man, Ben Reilly is a good person, and like kind of people said, he's sort of the best of Peter Parker in certain ways, the more honorable side without like some of the more dark anger that Peter can sometimes display. But Ben's capable of that too, especially after the years have weighed on him. So it's an interesting character, and it really comes down to how he is written. And really, all of this stuff, all these opinions we've talked about today are just kind of opinions and early reactions. I think any fan in chat could tell you there's plenty of like room for this story to be great and stuff like that. None of us have read it, so we don't know how it's going to be. These are just our opinions informed by decades of past Spider-Man stories and past comic book stories in general, and I think most of us recognize the pattern at hand here. Character gets killed off, replacement character exists for a while, original character comes back. We've seen that too many times for, I think, any other reaction to be appropriate. Like, we fans, I think, should be skeptical, and we should kind of look at this with a bit of a raised eyebrow based on comic book history. Now, we didn't know House of X was going to be what it was. We didn't know House of X was going to kind of undermine all of these tropes like comic book deaths and such. So it's perfectly possible that this could surprise us too. And I do want to kind of put that out there because this video is pretty pessimistic, and I think for good reason based on Marvel's behavior. But Marvel also did the House of X and everything with Hickman and stuff. And Zeb Wells is an interesting writer, along with Saladin Ahmed and everyone else, so it's perfectly possible it could be fun. Keenan said, K5, thanks for joining us. He says, I don't know nothing about this character. We do have videos about Ben Reilly that maybe I'll put the link to and can kind of get into the character's history more than I can kind of add them on the spot. But hopefully this video also provides some context. Sorry, just centering myself a little bit more in frame there. I don't know how much longer we're running, but I digress. Keenan was saying, I don't know if it's going to happen, but that Ben Reilly and Norman Osborn will fight each other as Norman Osborn killed Ben Reilly. Well, that's interesting given all the stuff that happened in Norman's supposed-ish redemption arc with Peter Parker, that like Norman's kind of in an interesting place as a character, but I'm not sure where Nick Spencer ended things with that, and I'd have to catch up a bit to fully know. It'd be interesting to get into that stuff, but I also don't need an angsty, grimdark revenge crest from Ben Reilly either. I'm just going to throw that out there because my instincts are anyone writing that kind of story where Ben Reilly goes up against Norman Osborn again would have to be wary of such things. I'm not saying it's going to have to be grim, dark, and terrible, but I am saying it's perfectly possible. Shadowcatcher says, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Ben Reilly dealing with mental issues about being a clone and making him sort of an unstable Spider-Man? And then Victor C says, Ben Reilly went through serious identity crisis and depression, referring to clones conspiracy stuff, but he managed to pull through and accept himself. And then Victor Shadowcatcher says, I see, thank you, Victor, which I love because that all I had to do was read that at that point. But yeah, so that's exactly it. They've kind of dealt with some of the clone conspiracy stuff in the years since then. Enough that Ben Reilly is kind of at a pretty open place as a character where they can do a lot with him. But I think it would be nice to kind of, I don't know, maybe, like, it would be cool if we could do something different. That's all I say. Basically, we're following the arc of, like, Superior Spider-Man, where Ben Reilly's going to take over, and we all kind of assume within 2 years Peter Parker's kind of coming back. If they can break that pattern up somehow, anyway, I don't know how, but if they can find a way to break this mold, then that would be interesting and perhaps worth all this time. But otherwise, I just feel we're stuck. Shadowcatcher says, I couldn't follow that Clone Saga thing to save my life. Well, yeah. The problem is they changed their plans while writing it, so it doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense along the way. Meanwhile, the Ultimate Clone Saga, I remember really liking as a kid. Well, I wasn't that young when I read it, but when I was a teenager, we'll say. Uh, and I found as the years have gone on, a lot of people have come to really appreciate the Ultimate Clone Saga. And though it's not the same thing, I think it kind of gets into what the Clone Saga could have been, which is kind of interesting. And there are some interesting ideas with these Spider-Man clones and people taking a relatively innocent human, well, like relative, I mean, like, because Peter's not like a traditional civilian, certainly, but just taking an innocent superhero like that and just cloning him over and over, which I think was well explored in the Ultimate Clone Saga story. But the original one is a bit of a mess, and that leads to people kind of being wary, I think, of Ben and Kane as characters, because their stories aren't easily accessible or like the easiest to understand, especially nowadays when these stories jump across different series and have huge year-long gaps in between appearances and stuff. It's kind of hard to follow. And then you compare that to someone much more straightforward as a character like Miles Morales or Spider-Gwen, and you can see why Marvel has drifted towards those characters more. Even Peter Parker is just easy for people to grab onto, and Ben Reilly is a risk. But that gets into what I was saying again, where it's like, well, it's hard to believe Ben's here to stay forever. Matt Vulcan was saying, I think a more interesting route would be Ben being an incredible Spider-Man, and when Peter comes back, Ben refuses to give up the mantle. Maybe for a while, Peter takes up the Scarlet Spider mantle. Okay, see, and like, I'm saying okay because it's just like, yeah, see, that's all you really need for it to be different, like I was saying, and just to break that mold a little bit and trying to do something different. Tevi's saying, I don't think Peter Parker is going to die. I mean, it's interesting. We don't. Like, that's a good point. We don't know that for sure. And I think I did say at one point during this stream, like, it would be kind of cool if that was the twist, like Peter and MJ end up getting married. But yeah, thanks for joining us, Tevi and stuff. 616 Man says, Ultimate Universe equals less convoluted. While that's true for stories like the Ultimate Clone Saga, over time, the Ultimate Universe did get pretty convoluted. To the extent I don't really fully agree with that when you look at the timeline of that universe. By the time the Ultimates start falling apart and Ultimatum comes around, things are pretty messy in terms of that continuity, and the difference between the two universes, like 616 and the Ultimate Universe, start to blur a lot. The original appeal of something like Ultimate Comics was that these stories were simpler and something like Clone Saga was accessible and readable. The problem is that changed over time until basically nothing but Miles was left. Tevia said, my theory is that Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and Mary Jane are finally going to get remarried again, and Ben Reilly is going to pick up where Peter leaves off. Like, and I brought that up earlier, but it certainly doesn't seem what they're advertising. It would be a cool twist, and I think I would prefer that because, like I said, it'd be more honest than this killing off Peter Parker and bringing in Ben Reilly. But also it's what they pretty much did for the original Clone Saga, which actually doesn't really change the likelihood of it now that I think about it, because that on the one hand, you have writers who might not want to repeat that story, but you might have writers who see that as a fun reference to the Clone Saga and might pursue such options. So I don't want to write it off entirely as a possibility. Victor is saying, it'd be interesting to see Ben Reilly and Miles interact since Miles never really knew Peter's brother. That's a cool way of thinking about it, actually, and I didn't bring that up on stream, but before I was thinking about that, and there's a lot of stuff in the world of Spider-Man that has changed since Ben Reilly was Spider-Man, which I would be very curious about and would like to see them explore a little. There's so much you could do with that, and I do think we could kind of do something like, especially like Ben and Miles is a good example, but all of these allies Spider-Man has made over the years since Ben took over, all these character developments. I'm really curious to see how Ben reacts to all of that stuff. Obviously, like, Parker Industries isn't a thing anymore, but there are all these people in Peter's life now that Ben's going to have to deal with. Mary Jane, I think, is not that, but everything else is a thing. And I'm kind of curious about that. The Shadowcatcher says, whoa, is MJ in the picture? So one more day doesn't apply to the new story? If so, that changes everything. Peter cannot die because that would be really messed up. I think you're missing a couple of links in that chain there, Shadowcatcher, because Mary Jane kind of is at least somewhat back together with Peter, and over the course of the Nick Spencer run, she's kind of become more of his story again. So her being present in this image doesn't really mean anything. And they've even made references to like Brand New Day as kind of a thing, and potential changes to the status quo of Spider-Man. I remain skeptical about all of that. I really don't think they're revisiting any of that stuff. And my prediction is Peter Parker is going to die. I think the less interesting version is what's going to happen. So I hate to disappoint. It just kind of seems like that's what's in the cards. Certainly that's what Marvel's advertising, and whether or not that's true is a bit up in the air, but it does seem like that's the direction we're going towards. Victor C. does mention something I forgot about, where there you can read the revised Clone Saga from 2009, which was well reviewed. I don't think I've read that yet myself, though. Tevi's saying, also, we do see MJ with a wedding ring in the picture with Peter dying, so I think my theory of them getting remarried may be coming up, all of which I approve. Yeah, but it could also just be something like them potentially getting remarried right before Peter's death or something like that, and I remain skeptical. It also isn't really explicitly a wedding ring, or it's plenty of times in the past there's been visual references like that without it really being a thing. It could also be that deal made with Mephisto kind of falling apart or coming to a head again, which would be a little more interesting than a traditional superhero death. Like I said, actually, before, breaking the mold from the sort of predicted route this story seems to exist on would be great, and any one of these things would enjoy that. Matt's saying, gotta get ready for work, enjoyed the video. Quick question, what do you think of Abomination being back in the new Marvel film? I'm stoked as he's one of my favorites. I have weird favorites. Well, that's pretty funny. What new Marvel film? I didn't know that. I'll look it up right now. Trying to think of what trailers recently came out that I may be zoned out for that. Oh, Shang-Chi. Okay. That's pretty fun. I'm pretty optimistic because I feel like that character is potentially interesting but didn't really get explored enough. And I am curious to see that. I haven't actually seen the Shang-Chi trailer yet. I saw it was out and then just got distracted and never got around to watching it, so I'll have to let you guys know what I think at some point. Tevi saying, well, Doc Ock did bring back Electro, so I think Sinister War will have Peter get beaten so much that he retires with MJ and they have to rely that Ben Reilly become the new Spider-Man. Yeah, but the thing is, Tevia, it's all about that, though. Like, you thought that when Nick Spencer was taking over. You thought that in the middle of Nick Spencer's arc. You thought that at the end of Nick Spencer's arc. So, that doesn't mean anything to me, unfortunately. Shadowcatcher says, I gotta find a way to get my hands on the revised version and more Tylenol. Fair to both. I assume it's available on Comixology, which is probably the easiest way, but maybe there's copies still kicking around at your local comic book store or some bookstore around you. I don't know. Although I do happen to know where you live, Shadowcatcher, vaguely, and maybe that's not as convenient for you, now that I think about it. So, fair enough. Tavia says, I love that 2009 Real Clone Saga because that story was really awesome and tons of fun. It also gave me Peter and MJ still married and their daughter Mayday Parker still alive and kicking. Well, I understand the Real Clone Saga kind of used a lot of elements of what was planned for that story, which is pretty cool. Victor says, okay, if you really wanted to write Ben's solo series after Peter comes back, would you let Ben stay and develop more on his relationship with Peter or take him to another city? Definitely the former. And that's almost like an easy question, but what he's getting at there is usually when Kane or Ben have their own series, it's always in their own story. But I would just say, yeah, don't even have him in his own solo series. Do kind of what Victor's getting at there and just have them both be Spider-Man or both be in a story with Ben as a supporting character and Peter having to deal with his relationship with his clone/brother. Victor keeps calling him a brother, but they're not brothers. They can call each other that, but it's more interesting to think of it what it is, a more bizarre thing, which is clone, created scientifically. 616 Man says DC Earth 1 book's pretty simple. If Ultimate ever rebooted, should probably go for that route with graphic novel format, but coming out on time unless late. Yeah, that would be a good way of doing it. I think that's part of the problem with the Ultimate series is they were in that comic book model of just keep publishing stories, but also we didn't have to tear it all down with Ultimatum. And I think because we had weird people like Jeff Loeb around, poor decisions were made. Let's just put it that way. Shadowcatcher, good to see ya, but he had to head out. Okay. Victor, I'm deleting that thing because that's illegal. And Google has all their rules about stuff. Tevia says, also, I am really hoping if Peter Parker doesn't die, I get my wish. And that opens the door for Peter and MJ being great parents to their daughter alive and kicking. I mean, that's what, like, what's it called is. Like, that other story that was running for a while with where they are a family and stuff. It does kind of feel like that's Marvel's way of saying, see, we published it, and it was only, like, so much. I know I did, like, videos on it, and I'm just blanking on the name now. Aggressively Relaxing says, can we let Dan Slott write it? I don't know what we're referring to there, but no, how about not? I am not a fan of Dan Slott and Spider-Man. Oh, renew your vows, that's it. Yeah, thank you, Tevia. Or anything like that. Tevia's saying, as for Ben Reilly being the new Spider-Man, do you believe Ben Reilly will reunite with his brother Kane? Because, let's face it, we haven't seen Kane in a very long time. Yeah, that almost feels like something they should do for that reason. I mean, last I heard, Kane was dead, and I haven't seen him since, but I assume he's come back to life at some point since then, because I'm thinking of Spider-Verse, and that was years ago, so I really don't know. Victor says they regard each other as brothers since Ben is his own person, and would you constantly tell your copy is a clone or your brother? I apologize, I was only trying to help out. Oh, it's fine. I just am like, but they're clones. Like, it's just, to me, it's more interesting thinking of them like that, but even if psychologically that does make a lot of sense for Ben, he's a fictional character, and it's just more interesting to think of. Yeah, like it was something done to Peter, which I think will always be an interesting dynamic between him and characters like Ben or Kane, because they're so other to him, and they might refer to each other as brothers, but I think Peter's being a little dishonest there because they did not grow up together. And they have the same memories, not shared memories like a real sibling, which I think is different and interesting and worth exploring. So it is like a cool character to explore. So we shouldn't discount that either. Ben's own inner narration and thoughts about things are often very different and distinct from Peter because of who and what he is. So it's kind of cool that he's taking over the story after so much has happened and so many traditional narrative things won't be going for him. Like the fact that Ben is the clone, whereas Peter is the original, which Marvel made such a big deal of back during the original Clone Saga. So I'm curious to see how that all plays out. Tevia says, last time I saw Kane, he came back to life in the terrible clone conspiracy nonsense. Oh, that's true. That did happen. But I don't even remember what happened to him there. K5 says, is Kane's last name Marco, or am I remembering wrong? I think you have him confused with Kane Marco, who's like the Juggernaut or something, right? Or some other character. No, I'm confused. Yeah, that's the Juggernaut. Kane with a K and an E is Peter's clone, and they are distinct characters. Kane Marco is spelled C-A-I-N, which is the Juggernaut. Tevye says, also Kane was in Spider-Geddon, which was an okay sequel, but man, oh man, it really didn't need to be an event. Yeah. What was I thinking of that? Wait. Spider-Geddon I didn't really bother fully indulging in. I got bored really quick of it and just sort of abandoned it. And that was about it. So I think we've explored this topic pretty thoroughly at this point, but thanks for everyone hanging out in chat, and giving their feedback, and just having a good time. And yeah, big news for Spider-Man. We'll see how that all plays out. I think this stuff is kind of going to start rolling out around September and October of this year, 2021. And we'll kind of see how that all plays out. But until then, we'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island.